My name is Dalsimer, and I'm running for Congress in Virginia's 11th District, and this is my Democracy Gauntlet, digital democracy and electronic voting. So electronic voting has gained a lot of momentum recently. There are a lot of advantages to it. It's cheaper, it's faster, it's more accurate, it's more convenient. It's not, however, probably ready for prime time, at least on a national scale. And the reasons are because, first, not everybody has broadband, so there are some equity issues there. Second, a lot of people care about their votes being private. And even though our votes are not legally guaranteed to be private, many people don't want other people knowing what your voting is. It's very easy now to tell if you have voted, but not who you have voted for. With electronic voting, they can quickly and easily see who you voted for, which is an issue for some people. And finally, and most significantly, electronic systems can be hacked. We've seen that widespread. The good news is all of these situations, all of these issues are completely solvable. And when they're solved, I would absolutely support electronic voting in a secure and equitable way. For the moment, I support 45-day no excuse early voting in person and by mail, and support having more polling places and reducing restrictions. So we've all seen the voter suppression efforts that have been going on, and most folks are probably familiar with the Mother Jones article that reported on the Heritage Foundation. So the Heritage Foundation reported to a group of wealthy donors how they had created a template for Georgia's voter suppression bill and how that could be used nationally. And it has been used nationally. We have over 400 voter suppression bills across 49 states, and 22 of them have already been passed. And what this means is there is dark money, wealthy, often anonymous donors, corporate or wealthy individuals who are influencing our voter system in ways that benefit their interests, their personal or corporate interests, rather than the interests of the people at large. So in order to combat this, Congress has come up with H.R. 1, the For the People Act, which is currently stalled in Senate, but which I fully support. It has 10 pillars that seek to protect and restore voting rights. What's interesting, though, is that there are a number of amendments to this, and you need to look at your representative and see, are they supporting H.R. 1 generally, or are they supporting all of the amendments? Because if we truly want all people to have the right to vote, we need to make sure that all people have the right to vote by supporting H.R. 1 and all of its amendments. And as I said a moment ago, I support 45-day, no excuse early voting by mail and in person. I absolutely think we need more polling places, more voting locations, including ballot boxes. And we need to make sure that our elections are fully supported by open and easily accessible voting and polling locations. My next topic is ranked choice voting, which I am a huge fan of. I also like star voting, but I think ranked choice voting is a little easier sometimes for folks. The thing I like best about ranked choice voting is that you can actually vote for the person that you want to see elected. Currently, people play a game. So in a primary, they might say, I really like candidate X, but I don't think candidate X can beat candidate Z in the general. So I'm going to vote candidate Y, who I think can beat candidate Z. With ranked choice voting, you eliminate that. You simply vote for the candidate you like the best, then the next best, and so on, 1, 2, 3, etc. There will no doubt be confusion when ranked choice voting is implemented, because people don't read directions and new systems are always a challenge. But once we get past that learning curve, we will have an election outcome that is based on putting in office the people that the people really want. The candidates will be those that most people genuinely want. So I am a full supporter of ranked choice voting. Freedom of the press and whistleblowers. So these two topics are related but separate. So I'm going to talk about freedom of the press first. Freedom of the press is guaranteed by our First Amendment to the Constitution, which gives us freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is not an absolute guarantee. You can't be free to libel someone or engage in seditious activities. But journalists are protected by our First Amendment and have been in this country since our Constitution was established. Many journalists have faced violence and fear of death overseas where the press is not free, but until recently have not faced that same sort of violence in this country, which they now are facing. Members of the press have been attacked here in this country. The press is being subverted and undermined. And a lot of that has to do with, frankly, the Trump administration calling out true stories as fake news and putting forth lies as alternative facts. And it has undermined the credibility of our press. In addition to which, all of the major news outlets are now run by just 5 owners, all mega corporations. So the news is being biased and modified. For instance, we saw that in the just past presidential election, where Bernie Sanders would get thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of people coming to a rally, and then you would look at the major news networks and there was no news about it. But candidate Biden would come and have a couple hundred people in a volleyball stadium, and they would be covered on all the major news networks. How do we fix that? I think the first thing we need to do is to provide funding or maybe free airtime to independent news outlets as well as to public television. And I think we need to make sure that the FCC is able to enforce a situation where if a news outlet is not actually reporting the news, but is in fact reporting facts that are not based in truth, let's say, I think that they should be required to call themselves entertainment or as biased news media. In addition to which, given the recent attacks on members of the press, for example, a couple weeks ago, a woman reporter was attacked by an anti-masker who ripped her mask off and assaulted her. I think that assaults on journalists should carry a hate enhancement because it is a hateful act. And I think those would go a long way to making sure that our news was actually unbiased and reported what was going on. In terms of whistleblowers, it's been about 50 years since Daniel Ellsberg released the Pentagon Papers, which told the story of the U.S. government involvement in Vietnam and in the conflict that lasted from 1945 to 1967, longer than the Afghan War. The conflict was never ratified by Congress, so it was never technically a war. And yet we spent billions of dollars on it. It cost thousands of lives, not to mention devastating Vietnam. And we're still feeling the repercussions of it now, today. If you fast forward to Julian Assange or Chelsea Manning and others who have tried to share information that they felt the American people should know about what the government was doing, what their government was doing, they have faced fear of reprisals and imprisonment just to try and get the truth out there. I think a government that was set up to be of the people, by the people, and for the people should be as transparent as possible, because with transparency comes accountability. And we have to protect whistleblowers, and we have to enable them to get the stories out. Ultimately, we need to elect people to office who are not going to engage in cover-ups and covert activities, because there's been too much of that in our history, and it has led to too much harm nationally and internationally. And it's time for a new, open way to do business in our government. Election reform. And now we come to the heart of the matter, because as a truly grassroots candidate, I and other grassroots candidates have pledged not to take any corporate PAC monies. And as Shirley Chisholm said, that makes us unbought and unbossed, because the reality is that most corporate politicians, the average typical Democrat or Republican, gets thousands, tens of thousands, even as much as millions of dollars from wealthy private interests and corporations, and then once elected, magically vote in ways that mirror the interests of those wealthy donors. of those mega donors rather than the interests of the people in the districts that they serve. And I think that as a grassroots candidate, as part of a movement to end that type of corruption, we need to get rid of that kind of private interest funding of politicians and of campaigns. So for me, I would make it illegal to accept corporate funding or excessive amounts of funding from any individual donors, put funding limits on the campaign contributions. And then I would publicly fund campaigns for qualified candidates at some given amount that is worked out by committee, depending on the level of office being run for. And I would also make sure that any money that was donated to a candidate was publicly viewable. Right now with dark money, you can't see who's been giving money to a specific candidate. And I think I would disallow lobbying to existing congressmen as well, because right now, lobbying and dollars influence our political process way too much. And I think by doing those things, by funding public campaigns, by putting limits on campaign contributions, by disallowing corporate interests and mega donors to fund candidates, I think that would go a long way, not only towards leveling the playing field, but reducing and eliminating corruption in our political process. And I actually have drafted a bill that I will introduce on day one when elected that will require that all candidates identify all the sources of their donations and require them to recuse themselves from voting on any bill that involves a company or industry from which they take money. So for example, if they take money from the chemical industry, they cannot vote on any bill that relates to chemicals of any kind. Or if they take money from the oil and gas industry, they cannot vote on fuel standards or other activities related to that. And it requires that they not be allowed to go to work for companies who have donated to their campaigns for at least 7 years. The last topic for today is abolish the Electoral College, which I fully support. There was a time in this nation when the vast majority of people could not read or write and couldn't vote. And perhaps it made sense then to have a paternalistic system in place where some white man represented the rest of a district in a voting process. But that time has long since passed, and we do not need an outdated, outmoded, and dysfunctional system that has led to bizarre election outcomes. Right now, one elector in California represents more than 700,000 constituents. And yet in Wyoming or the Dakotas, that same single elector represents less than 200,000 people. That's not right, and it's not fair. If elected, I would absolutely support abolishing the Electoral College so that you have one vote for one person. I would implement automatic voter registration at the age of 16, because if you're old enough to work and pay taxes, you are old enough to vote. Otherwise, it's taxation without representation, just like in DC, which we need to work on. I would publicly finance political campaigns through some sort of democracy dollars style plan. I would implement a 45-day early voting program, no excuse early voting, both in person and by mail. I would eliminate corporate PAC contributions to politicians, and I would make Election Day a federal holiday. They could make Juneteenth a federal holiday with just 2 weeks. Why can't we make Voting Day a national holiday? Because by making people vote on a day when they have to go to work, we are suppressing huge numbers of working people's votes. And I think that if we could implement these things, we would really be taking a huge stride forward towards a true democracy.